And what are some like notable milestones that you've achieved so far?
I think one of the biggest ones is when we could just drop the modules in. Obviously seeing the keyboard, of course, just getting the actual PCB, assembling it, and seeing it in your hand, holding it, and be like, oh, this is heavy, this is cool. And being able to press buttons and it outputs things on your computer, that's really cool.
All right. Welcome back, everybody, once again to the Naya Insights podcast. Today, I'll be joined with Benji and Kalin.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about some software stuff today and UI and UX. Bit of some insight on the team structure on that side of things, the intangible side of Naya Create, effectively.
Well, I'd say quite tangible.
Yeah, quite tangible, but more of the side that lives on the digital space and not in the physical space, right?
Makes sense, makes sense.
We're also going to have a little demonstration of the current Naya Flow type. So really interesting.
Or at least one of the dev branches of it.
One of the dev branches. An early pre-alpha, is it?
To clarify, there is one dev branch, the rest is all feature branches.
Okay.
Yeah. Development.
Indeed. And then we're going to go into some features and implementations within the actual software, as well as the challenges of balancing features, as well as simplicity and complexity of the UI and UX. What makes Naya Flow unique, some user feedback and usability, integration of strategies and realistic expectations, and then going into some community questions and just future plans for support and features. So yeah, maybe you guys can start by introducing yourselves, what you guys do, like your background, your role in the company.
You start.
Oh, God. Okay, well, he's my boss. Hi, I'm Benjamin. I'm the UI UX designer. I'm 24. Essentially, I just studied at Rijksuniversiteit Groningen, and I got a job here doing essentially a project for the team of just a couple of things that they wanted to have done before they had a different UI UX designer hired, and eventually, like, I got the project done, and then I was moved into making a couple of wireframes, and I kept asking, so when is the UI UX designer
Essentially, what
coming
he's trying
in?
to say is that we were very happy with his work, and we wanted to have him on full time.
Yeah,
Nice.
so I can't complain. It's been very fun.
Yes.
Nice.
Hi, I'm Kalin. I am the current project lead of, I say that as if there may be another one. There's not going to be another one, hopefully. But I'm the project lead of Naya Create, specifically focused on software, firmware, and EE, where necessary. I've studied software dev and game dev. Yeah, started with a company, but essentially from the start.
So what I will say about Kalin is that he is in his free time is super into workflow optimization. So which means that he's basically like one of the perfect people to have for the project. So it's very nice.
Makes sense that you're working on the actual software that is designed to set up all of these custom layers and like profiles and everything to actually optimize the interaction between hardware and software.
Yeah.
Which is what the bulk of the conversation will be, I think, surrounding. What is the name? If you guys can kind of announce it, maybe. I know what it is, but I don't know how you guys want to.
Wait, announcement?
I mean, I feel like, Naya Flow, but like there's all these other like...
Oh, right.
Right.
So, okay,
The
let's do a structure. From top to bottom, high level to low level, you start with Naya Flow. That is what the users interact with. What most people would hopefully have to interact with, and nothing more than that, if everything works well. Hey now.
Hey now.
Then below it we have core. Core is essentially a catch-all. This includes drivers, this includes third-party applications, and this includes plugins that, again, third-party applications may be making use of. And then below it is the Naya Create firmware, and it is based on ZMK. I don't want to say it's inspiration because we clearly use a lot of ZMK, but there are a lot of features that are clearly not part of ZMK that we had to develop ourselves. So it's ZMK plus Naya Create.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. And what is I guess, the vision or the goal of this software suite, like within the context of the keyboard? I mentioned a little bit already, but maybe to people who aren't really too familiar, why would you want a software that accompanies a keyboard like this?
If you have a piece of like hardware like this, you could, in essence, just, write your own firmware to make it do basically whatever you wanted, right? Within the limitations of your OS. But basically 99.99% of people cannot do that. So someone has to make a firmware and make a user interface that allows people to interact with the hardware in ways that they can adjust it to do what they want. We're providing hardware that the users can then customize and adapt to their use cases.
We make the distinction between 95 and 5% of users. Essentially 5% would imply anyone who probably has already programmed the keyboard themselves, who wouldn't care for the software, just want to make it work for themselves. They care about the advanced features. They already know what it's supposed to look like. They just want to put it on there. And then the 95% of users, which is people who maybe even for the first time are touching a split keyboard. And obviously one of our goals is to make this experience as smooth as possible and as good as possible, so they remain on an ergonomic keyboard, and an investment in the future that actually pays off kind of thing. So it's very much of the user interface is targeted or has its goal to cover these 95% of people. And then for the 5% of people who anyway wouldn't necessarily care too much about the interface, but maybe occasionally use it, and they only care about the advanced features, there is a slightly less pretty section of the user interface that they can interact with and really do advanced stuff with it, really custom stuff.
Yeah, because it's always sort of this this balancing act of development time between making a feature and then like testing it and making sure it's like usable. So we want all of the features that the 95% users are going to be using to be super usable, right? And then all of those features that are for the 5% of power users who want to be able to do this kind of stuff with their keyboard, but most people would never ever touch. We want it to be available in the software so they don't need to go digging and start coding their own stuff.
Yeah.
But these people are used to, like finicking. It's like, things are a puzzle, you know? So it's like, it doesn't matter if the UI and the UX is a little bit questionable.
On the deeper end.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Hidden behind
it's
developer settings.
Given the amount of features you need to for 95% of users, they will not use 90% of the features, right? They care about these 10%, and the 10% must work really well. So 10% works really well, and then there is another, like, let's say 70% in between that is, again, works really well, but it's not the key, the core. And then you have the remaining 20% that is available, is just not as streamlined because time, essentially.
Yeah.
Nice, actually. Like, I think that's a pretty good breakdown of like kind of like the goal. We're gonna go a little bit deeper, I think, in how exactly you balance this kind of simplicity over complexity kind of issue. But maybe we can like take a step back a little bit towards more so how many people are involved in like creating this software, and like just maybe getting a bit of an understanding of the development team and the structure behind that. Also just the like communication and like what are the current kind of projects that are ongoing at the moment.
Right. I think easiest is to start from top to bottom again, like high level, low level overview. Yeah. In the high level, this is Naya Flow, and here we have currently 4 people working on it actively. Yours truly, over here, is on the UI UX side. Then we have a software developer who is leading the project essentially. For the team of software developers, we have currently 2 interns who work on it. So essentially, it's them for making sure that the front end looks good and works fine. And then for the lower side, we have 3 more people, among those myself included. That is 2 firmware engineers. One of them is also EE specialized. And then on my end, it's firmware and OS level. So a total of 7 people right now.
Wow, really interesting. Okay. And what are some like notable milestones that you've achieved so far, just like collectively, like within maybe these tracks as well, kind of to understand, where the project is currently at, or like what's the roadmap and where we are currently.
Getting all of the key mapping, so being able to change what all the keys on Naya Create do, having the color mapping, so like changing what color the LEDs are, having that all done in the user interface and front end side, that was nice, because you finally get something that you can consider an MVP. Yeah, right.
True. Yeah,
something that is pretty to look at for people who may not know how this works.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's adjusting and adapting and like adding in like profiles and layers, and then adding in the module editing, editing macros and that kind of stuff. So currently what we're busy with is we're sort of exploring how to implement on the UI side all of the features that we want for the various modules. Disclaimer, this might not actually end up in the final version depending on how things go, but we're essentially looking to add in a radial menu for Naya Tune, because obviously you have this really fancy like tune module that you want to be able to do lots of different things with.
And that is really good at creating segments on its radius.
Yeah.
Like you have essentially rotational input, and you want that rotational input to change depending on what you do. So, like you can have it like that. You have like a button that you click somewhere on your keyboard that changes what the rotational input is, maybe adjust the sensitivity of stuff like that. But you can also have the dial itself be basically the only place you need to be. So you could, for example, tap the top of the glass, right? And then that opens up a radial menu overlay on your screen. That radial menu, then you can flick through to change what the dial does, and you click it again to confirm, and then now your dial does something different.
So kind of similar to like the Surface dial, except because like the Surface dial essentially connects to the screen, right? And then it has a radial menu around that, but just not physically like around that.
Yeah, I think a lot of different competitors do similar things. I think ProArt,
the Asus ProArt laptop. Does this.
ProArt does it. 3D Connection does it. They have a radial menu,
A rudimentary version, I think.
Yeah. It's sort of different because they're obviously not changing slider input. They're just doing like inputs, which is something we also explored, but we'll figure out.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we'll also like, I guess, look at the prototypes as well. And look at like visually how we're approaching it as well.
Yeah. Just like, let's just look at something that I made today as like a draft version. Yeah. That's not anxiety inducing.
No, totally not. I have full confidence.
Yeah, same.
Okay. That's super cool though. So I guess that's kind of where you're currently at with UI UX.
That's what makes up the most of my day over the past week. Yeah.
Okay, nice. And with the lower level stuff, like what are some milestones maybe on your end?
I think one of the biggest ones is when we could just drop the modules in.
Right.
That is one of the more fun ones because we went through several iterations trying to figure out. Obviously, we tried I2C first and foremost. It has the bandwidth, it has the speed. Wonderful example.
What is this? If you can like maybe elaborate.
That is a protocol. I'll fuzz it up a bit. It's a protocol essentially that you could use on a hardwire to communicate between two low-level computers.
Okay.
So it doesn't have any overhead the way USB would have. It doesn't have a very dedicated, essentially, protocol that you could use. It's just a line that you can communicate over, and it's the hardware that really makes a difference here.
Okay.
So this was one of the first things we tried. It didn't work despite there being quite a few studies into hot swapping. This was the initial idea, is to use R2C with a buffer. This didn't work, and then we tried a couple more in between. There were two simultaneous studies, and then UART appeared to be the right thing to do. And yeah, it worked fairly well. We are able to communicate, which is wonderful.
Nice.
There are some issues, of course, that we are running into. Syncing, of course, is a bit of an issue. There are a couple of tracks here that the next big milestone is going to be making sure that all the modules work at the correct polling rate, because currently everything works at the lower polling rate, mostly for development purposes. And once that we have everything figured out and we know we don't drop any packets within a certain margin of error. Then we increase the speed and of course test. But I think modules was a very big one. I think obviously seeing the keyboard, of course, just getting the actual PCB, assembling it and seeing it in your hand, holding it and be like, oh, this is heavy, this is cool. And being able to press buttons and it outputs things on your computer, that's really cool. Despite, like, of course, that is a lot of work. That is obviously, it's not that difficult. But it's just actually being able to see your own, the thing that you've been working on for so long, just hold it in your hands.
No, for sure. I mean, it's crazy to think also, I mean, on my side as well, like having the renders, for example, on my screen, like for like almost a year now, and then seeing it now kind of manifest into something real. And it's like, damn, I know these models inside out, but it's so different when you see it like in reality, in person, you know?
I mean, the thing is, right, we discussed the weight of Tune is a wonderful example because Tune came in not too long ago. We discussed the weight of Tune. We've discussed it, so I know it by the top of my head. You know how heavy it is. You know every part, how much it weighs. And then you're like, yeah, this is a sizable amount, like 250 grams. That's okay. You know what it is. It's not that much. And then you hold it in your hand and like, oh,
this might be a bit heavy, boys.
No, it's just the right amount.
No, okay.
No, true. I think with Tune, I think it's a really It's a really nice like weight, I think. With float, I think it's also the heavier the better.
The heavier the better.
Oh, for sure.
So
And,
I'm also really curious to get a hold of that.
I mean, very much looking forward to that. We already have the internal weight
Okay.
that is used to really make it usable when you pull on it, so it doesn't lift off.
Yeah.
And that already is, that's really good.
Nice. Okay, but yeah, super interesting. It's kind of getting sidetracked talking about
Hardware.
prototypes and everything.
Right, back to software.
Back to software, yeah, indeed. Yeah, so actually really nice kind of breakdown of milestones, I think, from you guys. I think it would be super interesting to now maybe transition to perhaps the live demo. We can talk about, maybe where we're currently at. Yes, kind of give a bit of a briefing of what it looks like and kind of, Like let's say I'm a user, I just received my Naya Create, I plugged it in, this pops up. What would be the sort of kind of main flow like that you guys would expect a basic user to kind of be going through?
So you have the installation process, obviously, and during the installation process, there's a couple of different, data points and information that we want to collect, such as, for example, what programs do you use? Because obviously the Naya Create is designed to be used with so many disparate different kinds of programs and that kind of stuff that if in the user interface we display all of the available options for all of these different softwares, then it just gets super overwhelming. So instead, it's like, say you're a videographer, you only really care about, the stuff for the videographer. You only have a tune and a touch.
Yeah.
It's like you don't care about any of the other stuff. We don't need to go showing that to you. There will be like obviously like just the standard sort of like create a profile or log in to your Naya Create profile, because we want to sort of use Naya Flow as this sort of community hub, because obviously there's a lot of people out there in the community who are just way more skilled and way more expert at various different softwares than we ever will be. So rather than us, making profiles and templates and like layouts for these softwares, we just want to figure out what tools we need to provide those tools, create a basic version, and just have the community itself iterate over those versions until they reach a good layout, right?
Okay, yeah, makes
Because
sense.
there's going to be like, even just among like single softwares, there's going to be so many different like workflows for different jobs and different, use cases that it's best to just let the experts actually decide for themselves how they want things to work.
Maybe speaking of how things should work or how they want them to work, we can go into the key mapping screen. And then,
before I think we go in, it's I think useful to note that we're going to run a user survey. Or
Yes. On the note of you guys knowing more than us about these specific softwares, we really want to gather your inputs about, first off, what softwares you guys are using, most of all. And then also, we want to find some people who would be interested in helping us, like taking a look at the software, doing some user testing, user validation, maybe giving us some insights on the softwares that they use and giving us sort of more insight and information that we can then use to make the product better. So if you're interested in that, the survey should already be live. Just like hit us up, click the link in the description down below, and fill that in. Thank you. We are so grateful.
We need your help.
Yes.
Right, so just before we switch, this is the hub screen. The hub screen is very much a placeholder. This is a very old hub screen. It was designed at the very beginning, and we haven't touched it because it's not a priority at the current moment. This is, as Benji mentioned, where the marketplace will come, but the screen that most people would probably be on most of the time is the bindings or the column mapping. So feel free to switch.
Just a note, the marketplace is the in-house term for the community page where people share stuff. There's no, we won't
There's
sell
no cost.
stuff.
There's no cost. There's nothing. It's just
Very important.
Very important to note. But yeah, so here's the bindings page.
Maybe make it a bit clearer what we're looking at. There we go.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah, sorry. Colors come later. But so essentially, this is the keyboard model here up at the top. This is the profile and the layer indicators. So it shows you what profile you're on and what layer you're on. Down here, you have the behavior section, and the behavior section is relative to what key you have selected. So basically, you have a list, like a matrix here of all the keys on your keyboard, and you can click on them to change what they do, how they behave. As of now, this W key, all it does is it's a W key. However, say if for whatever reason you wanted the W key to, when you held it down, you want it to be the command key. So you would then go to the action palette here, where it has basically all of the things in various tabs that you can set these keys to do, all these different behaviors. And you go, okay, here's the command key. I'll drag it over to hold. And now when I hold down this key, it'll be a command. And when I tap it, it'll be a W.
Nice.
So this gives you a lot of freedom to basically set it up to behave the way that you want it to. We aren't going to think too hard about, like what you can do with it. Obviously, we think about what you can do it in the sense of, is it worth it for us to implement this feature? Also something that we need user testing and validation for. We have limited development time. Which features are important? We would like to know, please. Okay. And then, yeah, I think that's sort of all of the basic features for the key mapping screen.
Yeah, I think so. I think while we're here, at least we can mention the overlay.
Overlay, okay, yeah.
Right, so a couple important things is just a quick one. Right, any key can be anything. You can reassign a bunch of other things to it. If you hover in here, you see what everything does. You know what this does while we have the software open. But the moment you close the software, if you don't already know what everything is, you may forget, you may not remember, or this may be a new profile that you're trying to, you have kind of no idea where everything is. So this is where the overlay comes in. It's the split between 95 and 5%.
Right.
Like for the 5% of users, they don't care about an overlay. They already know where everything is. They knew how to configure Create before they got it. They were done. But for 95% of the users, who maybe most of them, or at least a good portion of them, are complete novices and complete new users who have never used a split keyboard. They've never used layers before, for that matter. If you don't know where something is, or you have a new template, or you have something else, or you just forget, say you use Photoshop once in a blue moon, but you do have the Photoshop profile, you open Photoshop and you don't remember how to use it because it was too long ago, you press the button, you see where everything is, you select what you need. Another interesting one here is obviously the colors.
Yeah,
pretty. It's a very pretty area. Honestly, it's currently my favorite in terms of visuals. Looks better in my opinion than this.
Okay.
But this is a work in progress. These are the two main screens that you'll probably be interacting most of the time with. For most people. Where this is, let me just make this a bit clear, where this is your key mappings, and then here you go and you have your LEDs.
Right.
So it could be an RGB barf. You can absolutely go in that direction, a rainbow barf. But it could also be more specific. Like, for example, say that you have WASD, and that you want that to be just like very visible on your keyboard. So when you go in here, you turn the colors, you can see, all right, this is what it's mapped to.
Yeah.
Vice versa.
Yeah. No, but like I think I can kind of see as well like the kind of combination between like using different colors for different layers, or like for different programs even. For example, if I want to have a specific profile for like Photoshop, let's say, I make the layers blue, and then I can also kind of...
Maybe we go into that a tiny bit, but I'll do it on this screen because it's a bit easier to see.
Yeah.
Like, say that we are on the base layer. This layer is configured to do something. Of course, a notable one is here, for example, is only the hold is assigned. Therefore, it will show you that this keyboard icon, as in something is assigned, but it's not the tab, so it doesn't behave as a regular key. But if you were to assign that, then B, for example, just becomes B. There's nothing to it. This one has multiple things assigned to it. So there's these 3 dots that says, hey, this does more. But it has a default one. But where this becomes interesting is these layers, right? So you have a lot of layers that you can create. Depending on what you need to do, you may need a lot of layers. These are all, we consider them onboard. Again, names are placeholder.
Right.
There will be an actual thought put into what to call these.
Yeah, so basically there's like, for all of these terms, there's a lot of different words that are used for the same terminology.
Yeah.
So we sort of in-house decided, okay, this is the terminology that we're going to use for production, and then at some point we're going to have like a go-over over basically everything, probably during the language suite where we translate everything, where we're like, okay, this is going to be the actual term that we present to users to, explain things and show it to them.
And of course, we tried to keep it as similar as possible to everything else that exists, but even between different like open source keyboard firmwares, everyone calls it something else.
Yeah.
What
so
is an
finding somewhere in between what is a behavior, what is a... There is a gray zone. Like they roughly mean the same, but they technically behave slightly differently, and that makes a difference.
Yeah. Okay.
Because what is a key? Is it the physical thing? Is it the thing that get the HID code that gets sent to the computer? Is it the...
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
It's a bit of gray zone, and obviously there are too many names. You don't want as a user to have to remember all these things. It needs to be simple, it needs to be easy, it needs to be understandable.
Yeah.
But that's a polished sprint at a later point.
I wanted to ask a bit about the layers. Like, how would I, for example, change or like toggle these layers and like assign, like, let's say, for example, I wanted the B key to switch to layer 3. How would I do that?
So there are a couple of modes that you can use for this. So again, I'll fuzz it up a tiny bit. There is the toggle and there is the hold. Toggle is essentially when you press it, it's press and release. It switches you to that layer. And there's the hold. While you're holding this key, does something. We distinguish this by tap and hold inside of a software because it is a here in design language, people would essentially learn how to use this. This will have to make sense. But while you hold a specific key, then it does something else. So say, for example, that this B key, you want it to be something else. You want that to be a command on your second layer. Sorry, other way around. This is a different branch. One of the branches you can just drop it on. But
Yeah. So essentially, like we're currently on the dev branch, so this is all of the features that are hopefully bug free. You might have noticed one bug already, but don't worry about that. We're fixing it. But essentially, like on a different branch, we're working on extending the action palette, for example, because, for example, like these tabs, where this is the tab that's supposed to handle the layer actions for navigation between layers, and then there's just going to be an action go to layer 1. You drag it onto a tap action, it becomes a toggle. You drag it onto a hold action, it goes to that layer while it's held down.
I see how I can, for example, change the value of every key,
right?
And like the input action for that, but then how would I then tie it to toggling a layer?
So there are two more concepts here that I'll introduce. One is, it's one concept that has a couple of states. Essentially is a key can have a value. It could be none or it could be transparent. Why does that matter? Now, say that you want, for simplicity's sake, I would say that this key is what triggers it. So this is your layer. Let me clean it up. So it looks like this is the layer key. You want the B key to change. So when you hold this one, you want the B to change, but you want everything else to be normal. So these are then set to transparent. That means that if you were to hold the layer and press that key, it will still do whatever it does on this side. So it will still do this. But on this B key, it will do the command key. So while you're holding this button, and this will still also be in, because it's a hold, this will have to be on transparent.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a thing to set it up visually and coherently so it makes sense. But essentially, while you're holding that key, it does it. However, if it's a toggle, toggles don't have to be the same keys between layers. So you can say that on this layer, this is your toggle, right? You click it, you release it, and it brings you to layer 2. Names, don't worry about it. Here, however, you can say, I want me to bring me to layer 3. And then here you say, I want this one to bring me back to layer 0.
Okay.
That is very possible. So this is the difference in. And this is where currently we're working on adding these into the action palette of the different things that you can do, with the challenge of making it clear of what everything does and how this works.
Right, okay. So like with this branch, like I'm guessing the layers aren't like implemented yet.
Not fully, no, certainly not.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah. You can essentially map layers. And if you want to do in betweens, you kind of have to open the code afterwards after it creates a map.
Yeah, okay.
Slightly nudge it here. And
that's kind of what I was trying to like understand, because like I think like the mapping works very well. I was just kind of wondering if there's like a next step to tying the mapping to toggling another layer, but
there is.
It makes sense.
Absolutely.
So essentially, there's just an action, just like the A key is an action.
Fair. Yeah.
But yeah, like there's a lot of other stuff that is sort of like hidden away on other, half finished on other branches. Like for example, creating a new profile, creating a new layer. It's not meant to just create the new layer empty. It's like it will give you a prompt with a bunch of templates that you can choose from, right? That kind of stuff.
Cool.
Unless you want it to be empty, in which case you have a none or a transparent layer. Template you can pick from.
Yeah.
All right, but let's move on to quick color mapping. So quick color mapping, right? There are different tools that you can use. If you want everything in one go, you're going to use a fill. If you want individual keys, you're going to use a brush. You pick your color, you do whatever. You create a new color for any color you want. This is currently a placeholder in terms of selecting, because once we have verified the LEDs that we have, we're going to essentially figure out what are the colors that they exactly display, so as to match it visually to the screen. Because just because this is vibrant red on here, it doesn't necessarily mean it'll be just as vibrant on your keyboard. So there's a bit of a calibration there that needs to happen.
And like currently you can, for example, color things black, I think, which
what
does that even mean? What does that even mean?
Off, I guess.
Realistically, you could argue that, right? But that's more where the slider comes in. Where you can determine the brightness. You could do this.
So essentially, here's the list of your profiles. You can, like, for each of the profiles, you can have a drop down that can show you the layers.
And this is essentially a version of this where you have your different layers. So this will be click here. This is where you can do it.
But yeah, we wanted to give the user some place where they can, for example, where they have more of like a management overview of like what they have, rather than having to do that in the key mapping screen. Because like, for example, like moving layers between profiles, saving layers as templates, and you like seeing what templates you have, that kind of stuff. management, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Then selecting a profile, obviously we have the activation condition feature where your profile will activate upon a certain condition. So you have to create Boolean conditions out of multiple different event statements. And how do you do that? So this is sort of the system that we have here now.
Why are there activation conditions instead of, for example, the same way that you would toggle a layer?
Right.
Like where you can just drag it onto a queue and it toggles the layer.
Yeah.
You can, in theory, do this, and this is something that we are going to explore to put this in there, but it's a bit of a dance between OS software and the firmware. For example, the profiles on our end are intended as program-specific mappings.
Yeah.
So Photoshop opens, your computer knows Photoshop is open, our core application knows the drivers are open, the Photoshop application is open, and it tells the keyboard, hey, you're now in Photoshop mode. So essentially, if the keyboard presses the B button, by default, pressing B on Photoshop, the shortcut for brush.
Yeah.
But you can integrate it where if you were to hold down B, for example, and move your mouse up and down or rotate toon left and right, it increases or decreases your brush size.
Yeah.
All of these things require you to have the software open. And these individual integration remappings also require you to have the software open because the keyboard does not have that data, does not have access to that data. Essentially, the keyboard doesn't know more than the computer tells it, and the computer essentially asks it the whole time, hey, do you have something for me? Do you have something for me? Do you have something for me? It's event listener, essentially. So currently it listens to programs, so you could Firefox is in the foreground, it activates the Firefox profile. And this is where we make the distinction between onboard. Onboard refers to everything that is saved on the keyboard.
Right, like so on the firmware side.
On the firmware side. So everything, like you save it on here, you bring it to a different computer, it's going to respond exactly the same way.
Okay, yeah.
There's no differences there.
And can you save multiple layers on the onboard? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think
but not multiple profiles.
Not multiple profiles.
Okay. The key distinction here to understand is that profiles aren't essentially anything other than groups of layers.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And so there's nothing that you can
key bindings as well.
There's nothing you can do with profiles that you can't technically just do with just a list of layers.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It's just that profiles are the thing that we use as the integration. So you have Photoshop is easy because we're already talking about it, but you have the Photoshop integration. So you have one of these profiles that responds to Photoshop. So everything on here is Photoshop specific, and it's only while Photoshop is active and maybe you're holding down a specific key. But technically nothing changes on the keyboard. Everything is system side. So you need to have the software running in the background for it to take effect into the program that you have open.
Okay, nice.
Maybe you just want it to be based on your modules, right? You have a setup for video production, you have a setup for photo production. Photo production, you don't necessarily care about track, or you don't care about float, doesn't matter. So those are to your side, and then you have two other modules that are tune and touch you have inside. You do your photo editing, then you remove these input, track and float in there, and now you're in CAD, and it knows, if these two modules are in activation condition, switch to CAD mode.
Right, yeah.
And this is also where I previously mentioned that you can't quite put profiles on your layers, but there is a technicality, and is when you plug in a module, because a module is an event essentially. So plugging in a module can trigger a layer. We make a distinction between onboard and system side, and here's the distinction is also between macros is the same thing. Macros you have onboard and you have system side. Complexity is the difference. But you similarly have with profiles where you have triggers that are only system side. So Firefox is open or Firefox is in the foreground. Those are system side. So keyboard has no clue of that. But modules, for example, those are onboard side because the keyboard knows directly when the module is connected into it.
Like storing different profiles on the modules would be like the software side.
Would be the software.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I meant, where it's like you can change what profiles you have on your tune on here based on whether or not it's
right. You can do that too.
Plugged in.
Absolutely. Essentially, the keyboard has obviously can send out HID, and HID for, if you don't know, HID is essentially the agreed upon protocol by most
human interface something.
Human interface device.
Gotcha.
It's essentially a standardization for a message that is sent to the system and how that should be interpreted by the system. So if you make a mouse, you in the mouse have this standardization of the protocol, and you say, hey, I'm a mouse. Whenever a message is sent, X and Y coordinates, here you go, and then something moves on your screen. So the keyboard can send that, obviously with key presses as well. So key press down, key press up. And then it has the slightly more back-end side. This is the custom side where it also sends to our drivers and to the core application of this event has happened or this has happened. So for example, you press the B key. We have a specific keyboard matrix, and on the keyboard matrix, it just tells the system, hey, this key with this key code has been pressed. If something is assigned to it, it will overwrite anything that is HID. Right, so if you assign on it an integration with Photoshop, you don't want it to actually press the B key because that will alter what you're doing. Instead, it would essentially ignore what the B key does and then activate what it's supposed to activate. And this is where it also goes into the module attached. So you attach a module. It knows internally module has been attached, and if some behavior has been done internally to do something with it, it will do something with it. But it also sends out the same signal, hey, touch has been attached. And if there's anything on the system that makes use of it, it changes to that profile. And then anything that the keyboard sends out, if the profile is active, then it would ignore the HID side of it. Yeah, intercept it, and then repurposed if applicable.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Right.
Complicated stuff.
But yeah, like also just as a quick note, like so essentially like with the activation conditions for profiles, we have like essentially an event library, and the idea is to also do more stuff with this. Like for example, for lighting events. So for example, you would want to have an event that like your right battery is 10%. You create a lighting event that flashes the entire board red.
Right, that's super cool.
Yeah. And that is obviously outside of the just default behavior. When if your battery is low, it starts blinking at you. Still to be determined what exact behavior is, but essentially the idea of these events are to eventually go into the node system, and the node system is something that is very much so in discussion, but where you have, for most people, they want to activate a profile if something happens, right? That's super simple. I want my Photoshop to open, or I want my Firefox to open, and I want this profile to be active because it changes to moving between tabs or something else. But then there are slightly more complicated things that you want to do. And these are where we're going to go in node base, like if you know Unreal Engine and the blueprints of it, very similar, where you have an entry and an output, where if I plug in track, I want this to happen. So you have the open my Firefox window and then navigate to this page, while at the same time you have something else has happened on loop.
Right. Yeah. So it's like visual programming essentially, like for the events.
2D programming rather than 1D programming. Okay, yeah, so essentially what I've been working on today, so this is very, very drafty, is the radial menu for the dial. So essentially on a dial, you only have really three inputs. You have pressing down the crown, you have rotating while it's pressed down, and you have like rotating it without pressing it down.
To be very, very, very simple. To simplify it.
Yeah, to simplify, because obviously there's a touchpad that you can program, you can add buttons onto it, you can do gestures.
Different depth, you can do while button is pressed, do something else. It's a lot.
But anyway. basically any like any other hardware application that has a dial on it usually has some method by which you can easily change what the dial does without having to, like rely on anything else outside of the dial. And keeping things contained like that is very nice for just, humans' mental model of it. So I think there's examples of this for like the Pro Art by Asus.
On one of their laptops, they have a dial indeed, but with
like
the radio menu.
Yeah, like I think they actually have a couple of different products as well, like a mouse and stuff. Like they made this entire thing like a flagship product. But regardless, I digress. Yes. Like you also have for the 3D connection, also for the Microsoft Surface dial. So it's essentially you have a radial menu, so a circle with several different options, and you can
the GTA weapons menu.
Yeah, very similar. Very similar.
Exactly that. No, that is a radial menu, and then you can select things on that radial menu. So for example, you have volume control on one, then you press down the dial to open the radial menu. You scroll a bit to select, for example, scrolling. You click it, and then you scroll on your Firefox page, or you want to like play and pause, next track, all these types of different things that you don't want to essentially devote other space of your keyboard for, because you have this dial configuration that you want to just essentially dump across all of your different profiles and layers, and you don't want to have to bother to find a place to fit that on all of your profiles.
Could you also use it to switch between profiles?
Yeah, for sure. The goal is always to give users input options and then to make those input options as robust as possible, that you can bind it to basically anything.
Just anything,
And also keep it simple enough that it does not become overwhelming. I think is the very big one. But obviously, a lot of options will always be available. It's just if it's a slightly more advanced one, like say, for example, you want to trigger a layer from this radio menu, you can. This would be probably an advanced feature. It wouldn't look as pretty or as polished as the rest.
I would say we get into more like higher level stuff and just kind of on the user side what they can expect, and it's kind of like maybe a little bit into, for example, like the design philosophies.
Okay, so
like for example, like what if, for example, after the user surveys, you realize like you have to completely redesign everything.
Yeah, but that's perfectly fine. That's what the user surveys are for, right? Like that, we would love to get that feedback because then we know for certain that something is good. Right?
Okay, fair, yeah.
One of the design choices that we've made for usability is basically, so you have your modules, right? On the track module, there is a like the ball.
Yeah.
The trackball. Yeah. Okay. You have your trackball and you have four buttons. How many different like layouts for those 4 buttons are you realistically going to use? So it's less so like between the 4 buttons and more so that set of 4 button bindings. It's like you have that one, and then you have, for example, one where you have left click, right click, and middle mouse button.
Yeah, for example.
And then, you know, like there's like 2, maybe there's a third, maybe there's a 4th.
Yeah.
But you're going to have like 10 different layers. Like it becomes an absolute nightmare sort of especially for 8 modules per layer, because you need one for the left side and one for the right side. 8 different modules per layer. Say you only have 4 layers across your entire thing. That's still a ridiculous amount of, you know, module bindings to keep track of. So we decided to just group those bindings into a module configuration, and then you can just dump that module configuration on basically anywhere you want. This is
anywhere on a module.
This is anywhere. Anywhere in a module slot. This is non-final. Obviously, it's subject to change, but this is sort of the philosophy, the UX that we thought would be the nicest. Okay, so well, it takes inspiration from a lot of different things. Like I've looked at the design systems for like Apple and like all the big companies. I took a lot from material design. Obviously, like as you can see, some of you might have already noticed, like basically all of the icons outside of the ones that we had to make custom, those are some mostly placeholder, are from the material design icons, because it's really comprehensive and nice. And then, you know, there's even in a software where there's like really crazy stuff happening, there's still like some that are usable for it. But for example, for like the macro icon is placeholder, because we need to make a custom one for that.
So the idea is to view as much as possible about your module or about your keyboard that you're doing as much as possible on one screen. So you don't have to learn how to navigate to a specific thing to do a specific thing.
Yeah, so like everything within the modules is just going to be in one spot, essentially.
Right. Like try to view everything about, like you have tune, you can see everything about tune.
Yeah, okay.
You have it currently set up as a radio menu, so you only see the radio menu. From here you change it to be
just a simple dial.
Perfect. Then it just shows you everything that's relevant to that, and everything else adjusts similarly to display what only you need to care about.
All the relevant data, but hopefully all of it.
Yeah, hopefully.
You know? We try to keep all of the screens basically as similar as possible to each other to, you know, like prevent confusion about, you know, like where things are. So on the left, where it is applicable, such as the profile screen, such as the macro screen, there is a list of the relevant things that you can select. So for example, you have your list of macros. You have your basic macros that work always, and then you have the flow macros that only work when Naya Flow is open, because there's some specific feature in them that doesn't work over HID codes, like executing shell commands, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it technically works, but not over HID. However, it's slightly not liked. It's a gray zone area. But maybe we ignore that.
We'll figure it out. Okay. But yeah, so regardless, you have your macro open. Here in the middle, you have the macro model section that shows you basically the sequence of actions that your macro takes, the delays. So after 133.55 seconds, after pressing the key, the first shift gets pressed down. Why you would want that, who knows? But you can have it. It's sort of the distinction between like the 5% features and the 1% features. Yeah, and also there's also the distinction between features that add things that you couldn't do before, like for example, profile activation conditions, right? That adds a feature to the hardware that wouldn't have existed otherwise, you know, automatically updating what the profile is. But you also have features that can be added on that don't necessarily add anything new, but do make the things that you can do way, way easier, like the module configurations, right? Because like technically you could just go to all your 16 layers and update everyone individually when you want to make a change, but that's a nightmare. So obviously we sort of have our list of features somewhere floating around, you know, in our documentation, and then we sort of prioritize things based on, okay, how important is it? Does it add anything that we need?
Yeah.
How many users are going to use this? Is it a feature that we could potentially release after release, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, that we could just update into it. Like, I think node programming is one of those huge examples where we're definitely not going to have node programming.
That is
on release.
absolutely after release, and probably a good while after release.
Yeah, exactly.
It's essentially the way we group these is core features. So outside of the 95 and 5, these are for the specific features to indicate what kind of feature is it. You also have the core features and nice to haves, and obviously a couple of other things. It's a matter of like, obviously we promised a couple of features here and there for Create. These are prioritized at all times. So if these are not done, then some other feature may not get implemented if it's a nice to have, for example.
Yeah,
or even if it improves the UI a tiny bit, if it doesn't actually, if we don't have the core features, then it will receive a lower priority.
Yeah.
Okay.
We essentially have the mission critical ones that we're rushing to complete, and hopefully we have the mission critical ones done by release, and then afterwards we'll release the things that are that we think are cool. We'll probably do some like community feedback on what people actually want to see. We'll obviously hear from the community what they're missing, and then we can essentially piece by piece create turn Naya Flow into like the best proprietary software, and then hopefully after that, like also turn it into a software that is useful for people who don't even have Naya Create.
Okay.
That's sort of like the back pocket idea that we'll maybe get to in like 2-3 years, right?
Nice, yeah. I think a little bit more interesting would be maybe to go over some software integration questions. Like for example, like obviously we talking a lot about like different profiles and having them react to certain like softwares being opened. I think people have the main kind of question is you know, like there's so many different programs we could build integrations for. What does that look like kind of like in the scope of like like a task list that you have to kind of like complete? It's like, there's all these different programs. How do we tackle all these all at once? Or like, do you have some way to like...
It looks like an Excel sheet that my computer struggles to load.
Okay, yeah.
Really? I mean, I think that's more on the Excel software.
That's fair.
Yeah, but the idea being like, you know, like there's so many like programs, and like what does it look like on the development end to be like, okay, we have to build integrations for X, Y, Z. This is how we're going to approach it.
So essentially there are a couple of groups, right? So obviously we make some internal group distinctions between video editors, photographers, CAD engineers, etc. There are some core features to every single module that is also outlined, like this module should be able to be used for this definitely. And if you can use another one for it, is great. It's a nice to have, but it's not necessarily the core of that other module. So there is a distinction there. And then from all of these, we take this, and obviously then we take what does our user base actually use? Like what are the softwares that people use? What is the thing on a daily basis that is actually useful? And that also weighs into the actual prioritization of all of these softwares that you can do.
Survey. It's your last chance to like sort of build our priority list for the integrations, because obviously we have a couple that we promised that we're currently working on, but beyond that there's also like there's a huge list of softwares that would be really cool to integrate for, but we don't know yet whether it's possible to integrate for, or well, it's always possible to integrate for something using like shortcuts and key combinations, and just essentially providing in your action palette a list of all of the various different things that you can do in this software. But then even in that, you have to create a priority list of which features are important enough to actually add and which are just going to be clutter.
Right. And how would it look, for example, because like you mentioned, like this sort of like the structure of how the softwares communicate between each other, like you have Flow, you have like the driver's side, you have the firmware side. How would that work, for example? Like, would you have just out of the box, like you have just the Naya Flow and it can like integrate with all these other programs, or like would you have to have like third-party plugins for each software that you're integrating with?
All the ones that provide an API.
No, it's technically a proprietary plugin because it's built by us.
But
like for third-party software. It's a bit of a complex system. I think that the easiest way to explain this is that there are different softwares. Obviously, the Adobe suite is one suite of softwares, and there's the DaVinci suite. All of them use different SDKs and different APIs to interact directly with the software. And of course, they're not run by the same conglomerate, therefore they all have a different way to integrate these things into them. Even within the Adobe suite, Photoshop and Lightroom are currently on the UXP. They were previously on a different one, but they're on the UXP. And then if you were going to Premiere or something else, I believe Premiere right now is still on the legacy system. It's a different kind of system. So for every software, you have a different kind of approach with which you need to take to achieve the same integration as you would with everything. Now, some of these softwares don't have an API directly necessarily. Or don't have a way to. They don't have a way to create a plugin, but they do have an API you can interact with from an external program. So this is where we have essentially Core. What we call Core is an in-between application. This is what runs in your background. And this is for the applications that need it. So if you don't happen to have any applications that need this, Core will not be booted. This would only essentially work to, one, determine which program is in your face. And then the other one is if it needs to directly interact with something. So if the program that you're using doesn't have a plugin but needs to be interacted with directly, then you would go through Core, where Core would save the profiles, and then it would interact with the program by sending out a specific message over the predefined API. And this is also a fun one because some of these work with Python, some of these are C#, some of these are C++, some of these are C. Depending on the program that you're using, it's a very, very wide range of things you need to support. And then you have the plugins. The nice thing with the plugins is that the plugins very often can be self-contained. So in our software, you install it, you say, hey, I use Photoshop, I use Lightroom. Then it knows, okay, great, I'm going to download these plugins for you and install them. So you can actually just have them in your software without having to go to a third party and figure out how to install this. It's a one whole package. It installs it, and that interacts directly with the drivers. There are certain things that would still interact with Core. Obviously, it's a bit of a fuzzy area what interacts with, but in large lines, it's interacts directly with drivers and reads from them, which makes it so that Core wouldn't have too much to do with it.
Okay.
But it's one large dance to make everything work because of the...
And how would it look like, for example, developers, right? Like who want to use Naya Create, for example, like with Unity or Unreal Engine, for example, like because there's a lot of there's a lot of plugins that are designed for these engines, for example, like let's say by Oculus at the time with now it's Meta. But like you have essentially like SDKs, right, of like how to use this input device within a certain engine, and then you can kind of like have it.
Right. That's what you mean.
You know what I mean? So like I think like it would be super interesting, for example, if down the road there was some way to like, for example, have a plugin within Unreal, let's say, to like map variables within Unreal onto Create through this kind of bridge,
so
for example.
In essence, you would be able to do that anyway. So the plugin would, say you're in Photoshop, the plugin would essentially be, we still have to figure out where exactly you configure this, because this is a lot easier on a bigger screen than a tiny plugin window. But you can configure everything what it does, right? So you can still put things there where they're supposed to be. But then you get into the more, like, say, for example, we wouldn't support Unreal Engine. And there are a lot of people who want Unreal Engine. Or there happens to be this one dude who really likes Unreal Engine, really likes Create. And it's like, why do you not have this? We will be working on creating an open SDK that you can interact with to do specific things. Like, say, for example, we haven't gotten around to supporting a specific software. You have the time, you have the knowledge, and you want to do this, you can absolutely read up then on the documentation, use our SDK and create a plugin for your specific application, or know how to interact with Core so as to do the same thing. So there will be this open SDK. This, unfortunately, will not be on release because this is a very massive project to maintain. Given that it's an open SDK, it will also be partly open source. This is where we would also love the input from the community. But this is a massive project and massive undertaking, so this is a later addition after release.
After our core features are done.
After our core features are done.
But it's not to say that like
horrible jokes.
The SDK will not be on release, but obviously support for programs like Unity or Unreal Engine could
sure.
be.
Yes. I don't want to overpromise anything. As much as I'd like to say we'll support all of the programs, obviously that's not possible.
That's also another reason why the survey is important, I think, right?
Yes.
Then we can really see what the priority is based on actual user data.
It's more to verify what our internal thinking is.
Right.
We have an internal list. I think we're at 150 right now of things that we think should be in there. and in what order they should be integrated. But we want to have another verification factor. Of course, it's a community survey, so it's not representative of all of our user base, but I believe it's a very good point to have as a verification point. But yeah, there are a bunch of softwares. We're going one by one, and we do not intend to stop integrating these. So once Create is released, there will be more integrations that will come out, and at one point down the line, we'll also have this open SDK that can be used to create your own plugins for this if you wish, and then hopefully by that place introduce it also in the marketplace. It's the marketplace, but there's no paying. I don't know.
Yeah. I think like I wanted the name Cloud for the internal one, but people didn't like that, so it became Marketplace for some reason.
It's Marketplace makes most. It's more of a community driven. It's the It's the forum, the community.
Oh, forum is
It's
nice.
where people can create their own stuff. You can obviously upload it and say, "This is what I do." People can rate it. It's the same. It's in a similar way a marketplace as the extensions menu is
Naya
in
Town
VS
Square.
Code, for example.
Workshop.
But
It's like what Steam does.
workshop. I don't know if we can call it that, but if we can, that would be really cool. Naya workshop.
Yeah, no, okay, yeah, no.
I don't know. Maybe.
Regardless,
That's for the legal team.
Yeah, no. At some point, obviously, we're gonna get like the marketing team in, and we're gonna sort of discuss what all the terminology
Allow us to introduce ourselves.
outward facing.
Okay, so I think super nice deep dive there into just overall features, integrations, functionalities, like all of this. Yeah, I think it was super nice. I think we can go towards the community questions now, unless you guys feel like we can go into any more topics that we haven't
realistically,
covered.
there's so much more to talk
Yeah,
about.
of course.
So I think in a later podcast we'll dive deep into it. Like what I could say is like if people in the comments can let us know what is actually interesting from the software, what do you want to know more about? We could do a deeper dive into that. Into how it functions or etc. Just go over the functions and get some feedback on it.
For sure.
Yeah, and if people are interested, we can always like at some point start doing like just software showcases, right? Like because obviously we're going to be creating like these versions that can be used for user testing and user validation. So it's like people are going to see that it's out there anyway. We might as well give a better explanation as to why things are the way they are,
like case by case.
Yeah, what the reasoning behind things is, and then people can
100%
give their feedback.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess it's a little bit more of just questions that we've kind of found through our Discord and everything,
right?
That we can maybe like address a bit more directly. So a lot of people are interested in understanding how exactly we plan to integrate our float module. In terms of there's a lot of work that 3D Connection has already done with their Space Mouse, and the question is essentially like, is this float essentially just going to emulate the Space Mouse within programs, or is it going to have its own sort of framework and architecture that, like it's going to be standalone?
It's going to be its own architecture. Okay. A lot of it is on the legal basis as to what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. So a lot of it is on legal basis, and unfortunately, there is no standard. Like there is somewhat a 3D standard in the HID spec. It's not, to our knowledge and to our testing, it's not what is being used by, for example, by 3D Connection. They have their own thing, they have their own drivers, their own plugins, everything that works on its own, which makes perfect sense given the complexity of the product. Similarly, we have the same thing where we have our own SDK that is going to be available for programs to integrate into things. Either we will be integrating into it if it's a program that we know, or if a company reaches out and says, hey, we're doing a CAD software, we really want to have your float module work with our software. Of course, we can then discuss how that is done and integrated. But it is not by no means, it's not an emulation of 3D Connection in terms of reusing the same things. That being said, we are aiming with the way it functions and with the way that you can configure it, that it very much feels at home for most people, like people who have been using this for years, that they don't have to completely relearn a completely new thing, but it feels at home with the best features from one side and what we think can be done better or to fit specifically our float module.
But yeah.
Nice.
Now you might understand why our team is just a little bit bigger, because we're essentially like creating 5 different products at the same time.
100%.
Right?
Yeah, definitely. It's crazy, honestly.
Yeah. It's a lot of fun. I mean, like, that's why you work at a startup, right? So you can just do lots of different things, put on lots of different hats.
Definitely. 100%. Yeah.
Our goal here is to create a software that's actually usable to most people, like useful to most people to install, because you do lose on a lot of functionality if you don't have the software.
Right.
Not in terms of you need to keep the software open for it to work, but configuring things or changing things or say a program that opens. But of course, there are cases where you simply cannot have the software, or you maybe don't want to have the software. That's also completely fine. In those cases, you can absolutely use the keyboard completely without the software. Configure it once, don't touch it again. It saves on the keyboard, use it between devices, it will work exactly the same way. Everything is locally stored.
Okay, nice. And the question here is, if I save my layers and configuration and connect the keyboard to another device without the software, will my configuration be saved on the board, or do I need to install the software on the new device and re-access my account?
Okay, this is specifically to do, I believe, if I interpret the question correctly, with storing things on board. Which is like, if I store all of my layers on board, how does that behave? It stays on the keyboard, you can reuse it and do. It's essentially on the keyboard.
Notably, only the onboard profile, right?
Right.
So anything that is on any of your other profiles or layers,
Right.
that is linked to your account, and you would then need to log in to access those.
So essentially, you only have one possible profile you can save on the board, which is the base layer.
Correct.
And then like those profiles have a certain set of layers which you can have on the board.
Yep.
But then everything else is on the software.
Correct. And then you could also make the argument, if you have two creates, for example,
Yeah.
how do you sync this? There are two methods. One is indeed, as Benji mentioned, which is your account. But if you don't want to use an account, theoretically also possible, you can essentially export everything. So there is an export keyboard profile, which is the onboard one. So it creates a file that you can then move between systems, completely different system, install the profile on a different keyboard. That's not an issue. You can similarly export your profiles that are system-side profiles. You can export it in a similar fashion. For backing up purposes, this is also quite handy if you just want to have a backup of what you're doing. You can do this. And then if you were to connect two creates, of course, the software is smart enough to detect, hey, there are two of them. So it's going to prompt you, which one do you want to configure now? We currently have no special features planned, as it is a tiny bit more low prio, no special features planned for migrating from one to the other keyboard, for example. Like if you have two keyboards and you edit one, and then there's another button that says transfer to, that's not planned. That's not something that currently
it's one
is
of
in the making.
Yeah, it's one of those features that makes life like easier for one for a use case that can already be done via a different, slightly more annoying route.
Yeah,
right.
And
Given how many people are likely to use this, I'm sorry, but you'll have to just export it to a file and then.
That being said, if you really want to
Import
make
it.
it, then buy two keyboards. Get everyone to buy two keyboards, so suddenly this becomes a priority.
Yeah, true. Okay, cool. I'd like those are most of the questions kind of from the community side that we could dig up. I guess, yeah, like we can start to wrap this up. If there's any sort of last kind of thoughts on, for example, future ideas. We mentioned the visual coding for the events. Are there any other like interesting developments that you have kind of in mind for the future, nice to haves vision?
I think these are the core that we are very strongly considering and very passionate about ourselves. So these are things that we'll go through a very rigorous process to determine, can we make it, how much time, etc. So this is something that we'll go through. I think another one is that we haven't yet talked about the software in too much detail yet. So this will be the first
just
podcast
like
that is available,
introduction,
first intro to it.
Yeah.
So I expect there to be more questions.
100%.
Once those are there and we see a lot of questions about it, I think we just do another one and we answer all of the questions.
Yeah, great. No, thanks a lot. Hopefully, there's been enough information here to, get your feet wet into like what's going on with the software side, on the UX side, UI side, integrations. If there's any more questions, obviously, let us know on the Discord, YouTube comments, Instagram, wherever you can reach us. We'll be like happy to help.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks a lot for coming on and talking to me. Hopefully we can have another sit down again soon.
Yeah, sounds good.
Likewise.
Peace, guys. Thank you.
Bye-bye.